ดีทุกคนค่ะก็ขอบคุณมากนะคะที่กรุณาฝ่าความไม่สะดวกต่างๆมาในวันนี้นะคะเราก็จะเริ่มเร็วนิดนึงเพราะว่าก็ยังเป็นสถานการณ์แห่งความไม่มั่นคงอยู่นะคะจุฬาปิดประตู 6 โมงเย็นนะคะเราก็อยากให้ทุกคนออกได้ภายใน 5 โมงครึ่ง 5 โมง 40อะไรอย่างเงี้ยนะคะจะได้กลับบ้านกันโดยสวัสดิภาพนะคะไม่ว่าจะเอารถมาไม่เอารถมาก็ตามนะคะวันนี้จะเป็นเสียงในฟิล์มนะคะภาษาอังกฤษนะคะก็ดิฉันก็จะเป็นผู้ดำเนินรายการนะคะแล้วก็ขอเชิญเข้าสู่ภาคภาษาอังกฤษได้แล้วค่ะ Okay. So good evening and welcome everyone to our lecture series on global history, Asia from the global perspective. And today we're very fortunate to have Dr. Stefan Hell here with us. He's from you're now based in Jakarta, at the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta, and he also is a specialist on the history of Southeast Asia. Actually, he just had a book came out in publication just a few years ago, right, on Siam and the League of Nations. And it received quite, it has been rather well received, at least among my friends in Singapore and Malaysia, and also some of my colleagues in Bangkok have already read the book and suggested that it's a really important work in this field here. And Dr. Stefan Hell is a friend and colleague of our very own Ajahn Pawan at the history department. Actually, we went to the same schools, right? Master's degree in Tübingen and then a PhD in Leiden in history and philosophy. And of course, this what Stefan will be talking about today, Siam in World War I. Which back then they probably called it the Great War, right? Before they realized that there was going to be a World War II coming up. And this project is somehow an extension or an expansion, a development from your book project, which is kind of connected to the book project, which was the Siam and the League of Nations. And this is, from my understanding, this is kind of sort of a research, an ongoing research that in fact is a project that you're working on with Ajahn Pawan as well. And actually today it would probably be much better if Ajahn Pawan was the host, the moderator, but Ajahn Pawan really wanted me to shine today, so she insisted on getting a sore throat, and so I get to be the moderator. But we're very, actually the First World War, we tend to think that it's something about Europe, right? That it involves Europe and America, and the further it gets into Asia, this is Turkey, or and we don't think of it of being an Asian thing, not an East Asian thing, not a Southeast Asian thing. Which, in fact, actually, I do Chinese history, and I know that the First World War was actually very important for China as well. But we in Southeast Asia, even though we have so much documents at the National Archives in Thailand on the First World War, but there seems to be very little work, not enough work done on it. So I think we're very fortunate today to have such an expert in this topic to contribute to the theme of our lecture series today, which I think would world history, global history, Asia from the global perspective of the 20th century would definitely not be complete if we don't talk about the First World War and how it's so intricately connected to the development of history in Siam and Thailand and Southeast Asia. So without further ado, I would like to hand the floor over to Dr. Stefan Hell. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You get your own mic.
Okay. If you allow me, I'll sit down. I can have a look at what I noted down here. Thank you, Ajahn Wasana. Thank you, Ajahn Pawan. Thanks to the history department for having me here today. Thanks all of you for coming here. I understand the traffic situation isn't the best So I very much appreciate that you found your way here. I would spend about a good hour presenting this topic to you. And what I thought I'd do is to begin with a quote. It was the proudest day of my life. The memory of this glorious event will forever live in my mind. Now, what day are we talking about? We're talking about the 10th of December of 1918, when Thai soldiers drove supply trucks across the border from France to Germany. And who made this powerful statement? Well, it was no other than King Rama VI himself, the King of Thailand, in the 8th year of his reign, declared this to be the proudest day of his life. In the year 1918, that's pretty much exactly 100 years ago, the Kingdom of Thailand did something unprecedented, and something it's never done in the 100 years since. It sent troops across the ocean to fight outside of Asia, in Europe, in fact. Thai troops occupied Germany. I'm German, so it has quite a significance for me to say this. A century ago, the decisions leading up to this event and its implications were indeed profound. Let's take two of them. Firstly, imagine the impact this had on the psyche of the political and military actors in Bangkok. Here was the elite of a proud and independent country which was struggling to come to grips with a rapidly modernizing world dominated by Western ideology, Western technology, Western imperialism, Western-dominated international trade, Western machinery, and military technology. Having had to concede part of the country's territory and sovereignty, here was this elite in 1918, elated by the news of its troops having occupied the territory of exactly one of those Western states. Her troops had been standing shoulder by shoulder with French, British, and American troops in a war that was undoubtedly a just cause in the eyes of the policymakers in Bangkok at that time. Now, secondly, imagine the impact these events had on the further development of the kingdom. They served as a catalyst for the ensuing emancipation from the unequal treaties, the regaining of sovereignty, the establishment of a firm position in the emerging international system. This is the League of Nations that Ajahn Wasana referred to. And this is a system that is, to some degree, still with us today. Thai soldiers standing on German soil, this was a powerful symbol of the authority of the king and the sense of patriotism he sought to ingrain in his peoples. Now, by stating this, I'm probably boring you. You know all this. So why am I bringing it up? Well, significant anniversaries are indeed upon us. This year will be filled with commemorations of the outbreak of the Second World War in 1914. It's already begun if you read Western newspapers, watch Western TV. 2017 will see 100 years of Thailand's declaration of war on Germany. And in 2018, indeed, it will be 100 years since the occupation of Germany and also of the end of the war. This would make it worth of at least cursory attention, I would say, but I believe matters are more profound. We're talking about arguably the most significant international event in modern Thai history. Certainly the most significant international event in Thai history outside of Southeast Asia. I'm not qualifying this statement by saying until another or since another. No, this was the most significant event in Thailand's modern international history. No other event rivals it in its political impact, in the political impact it had, and in the gain in international stature that it enabled. In any case, I was eager to consult one of the many studies of this event to understand the intricacies of the decision-making processes, the details of what happened, the different dimensions of the impact, but I found nothing. And this is why I'm here today. I could not find a proper modern historiographical study of Thailand's involvement in World War I. So, after a bit of preliminary research and decisions, I decided to embark on such a study, and I found the perfect co-author for it in Ajahn Pawan. And we began our work on the project in earnest in late 2012. Today, what I thought is I would like to share with you where we are at this point in time in our research. That means I'm not presenting a polished and neatly completed project to you, but rather it's a bit like an update from the workshop floor, if you want. What we've done so far. I hope this preliminary character won't bore you, and I hope that in turn I can benefit from any comments and suggestions and corrections that you might have on the topic. Now, let's turn our attention to the story itself. Let me sketch first what I'll talk about. I would first look at the phase of Siam's neutrality. That's from 1914 to 1917. Then move to the war years, 1917 to 19. Here, I would first touch on the impact of the war here in Siam, then on the impact it had for the small number of Kontai in Germany, and then the main part of my talk would focus on the so-called Siamese Expeditionary Force, the aviation and motor contingents that Siam sent to Europe. So let's begin by looking at the period of World War I during which Siam chose to be neutral. Siam, of course, in 1914 was a country facing a number of challenges. Internationally, its sovereignty was not secure. Its existence depended to a large part on the imperialist policies of its neighbors, Britain and France. It had been forced to concede territory to them only a few years earlier and was limited in its foreign trade and domestic jurisdiction by unequal treaties. Society was agrarian with a small urban population. Industrial development was in its infancy. Much of commercial activity was in the hands of Chinese immigrants who had been coming to Siam in large numbers in the previous decades. After the long and transformative reign of his father, King Wachirawut had ascended the throne in 1910 and had already faced a serious challenge to his rule in an averted plot attempt originating among junior army officers in 1912. The state was undergoing a far-reaching administrative reform process, during which it adopted many elements of Western administrative culture in order to strengthen central rule over the kingdom and make government more effective. The state employed Western technical advisors and developed a legal system along Western lines. This reform process was driven by the king's uncles, cousins, and brothers, some of whom had been doing so since way back in the previous reign, and increasingly also by an emerging civilian bureaucracy. The West, as I said earlier already, was the focal point for the ruling royal and civilian elite. It epitomized modernity and civilization in statecraft, military, law, technology, arts, fashion, education, and commerce. On this slide here, you can see a few different aspects of traditional and modern Bangkok at the time. Bangkok had a sizable community of Western diplomats and businessmen, many of them lobbying the Thai decision-makers non-stop. The British were dominant, but also all others, whether they were French, German, Dutch, Danish, Portuguese, Austrian, Russian, American, or the notable non-Western exception, Japanese, were all busy vying for political and economic influence in mining, in timber, shipping, and trading, or in infrastructure development. Now, of all of these, let's look at the Germans in particular. Germany was a latecomer to the colonial ambitions that dominated its European neighbors' views of Africa and Asia. Preoccupied with the unification of its fragmented territory until the late 19th century, Germany managed to secure sizable territories in Africa, but only select possessions in Asia and in the Pacific. In Southeast Asia, and in the scope of Siam's policymakers, Germany did not appear as a colonial power. It was therefore perceived markedly differently in Bangkok than were imperialist neighbors, Britain, France, and the Netherlands. German trading firms successfully set up shop in Bangkok, and German shipping lines soon dominated passenger and cargo transport between Bangkok and the two major trading hubs, Singapore and Hong Kong. The latter was so much the case that when war broke out in 1914 and German ships were no longer available, of course they had to hide from the British ships, Siam's foreign trade actually collapsed for a period of several weeks before ships of other countries filled this gap. Here, is a slide which on the left shows you a postcard of these days depicting the foreign clubs in Bangkok, among them the German club. This is how the Westerners lived and socialized at the time here in Bangkok. On the right is something I find kind of funny. It's an invitation to an evening at the German club here in Bangkok with, true to the German stereotype, free beer. German technology was considered as much cutting edge 100 years ago as it is arguably today. The advanced technology of the time was railway and telegraph, for both of which Siam employed German firms, engineers, equipment, and technological standards. The same can be said for Western medicine. Since the reign of Rama V, Siam had been employing German technology and expertise for the administrative and technological development of the country. German influence among the large group of foreign advisors and competing foreign interests in Siam served, together with that of the US, to counterbalance the very strong influence of France and, of course, Great Britain. Now let's shift our focus again back to Europe. The First World War was one of the most horrific events in human history. During 4 years, it cost nearly 17 million lives and left many more wounded. It altered the course of history, it brought down empires, it gave rise to new ideologies, and planted the seeds for further destruction brought about by the Second World War. The war broke out at a time when industrialization and modern technologies, the steam engine, telephone, telegraph, as well as the beginning of what we would today call economic globalization, interconnected societies, especially those in Europe. And there was general optimism and confidence in a peaceful future in the Western world right up to the months before the war broke out. The optimism quickly disappeared because of Germany recklessly pursuing a hyper-nationalistic foreign policy and its imperialist ambitions, and because of mismanagement of the situation by Britain and France. Suddenly everyone entered into what seemed to be something like a mutual suicide pact, driven by chauvinism, by hyper-nationalism, by political and diplomatic ineptitude, and by outright recklessness. Here you see a few of the elements that we associate with the First World War. You see mechanization, you see tanks, you see heavy artillery. You see on the top left trench war. You see chemical warfare on the bottom right. This was a war that superseded anything that people could imagine at the time. It was really something horrific for everyone involved. When the war broke out, the Siamese minister in Paris, Prince Jarun, wrote to the king, I quote, "It is extremely interesting to be in the midst of the history-making epoch. I never dreamt that I should live to see, much less be in the midst of a European war. It is awful to think what calamities will come. The result will be far-reaching, so far that no one can tell. This is a war not of countries, but of nationalities. Teutons, an old word for Germans, versus the rest of the world. For by their mad doings, the Germans have succeeded in alienating all sympathies. Even neutral countries are against them at heart. If they win in this life and death struggle, they certainly deserve to be master of the world." End quote. Here in Bangkok, there was no argument over policy when the war in Europe broke out in August 1914, and the government issued a royal proclamation for the observance of neutrality in the war. It was without question a prudent decision to stay out of a conflict that came sudden, in which Siam had no stake, and the trajectory of which was impossible to foresee. As Foreign Minister Prince Thewawong put it as late as mid-1916, quote, "I'm sure that as long as Siam is maintaining her neutrality, there will be no danger from Great Britain." But he also added, "My only hope is that Germany will not force Siam from her neutrality to side with a belligerent party, even by foreboding that there will be any danger for Siam after the war." End quote. However, During the following 3 years, between mid-1914 and mid-1917, the position of neutrality became increasingly difficult to uphold. For one, the war forced Siam's officials to increasingly take sides in everyday matters involving Germans or Britons or French. Secondly, relations between the enemy representatives in Siam became increasingly antagonistic. No surprise there. Thirdly, lobbying from both sides to pull Siam into its camp became at times overwhelming. And finally, news of German actions on the battlegrounds in Europe in a war of unprecedented mass killings, industrial and chemical warfare gradually pushed those with a neutral stance into the Allied camp. In our research, we've learned of numerous instances during these years where belligerent countries tried to influence Siam's policy in their favor. The Germans even launched a propaganda newspaper here in Bangkok. The British, not to be outdone, made King Wachirawut an honorary general in the British Army. As one observer put it, it was, quote, the first time in history that an Oriental monarch had been made a general in the British Army. Bangkok became a propaganda battleground, and during these years of Thai neutrality, the prize being an important strategic alliance and commercial benefits in the only market up for grabs in what was called the Far East. For Germany, Siam was in fact the only country in the region in which they could hope to keep up commercial and political interests and keep them alive until an anticipated victory. Moreover, 9 ocean-going German ships had sought refuge in Siam's neutral waters, anchored behind the sandbar at Pak Nam and in safety from enemy warships. The German efforts in Bangkok to make preparations for the troops' arrival. Major General Praya Pichai had spent several years in Belgium and France, where he had received his military training. He spoke French and understood French military culture and was therefore chosen to lead the Siamese contingent. Praya Pichai and his fellow officers traveled to Europe and were, rather remarkably, received by King George V of England and by French President Clemenceau. They visited the front and made arrangements for the troops in Marseille and in other camps. Back here in Siam, it took time to sort out transportation, but by 20 June, some 1,200 officers and men boarded the SS Empire for Europe. The King and Prince Chakrapong had sent them off at Sanam Luang and had dined with the officers the night before their departure. The Bangkok Times reported, quote, the riverbanks were full with cheering crowds. All jetties and landings were crowded to a dangerous point. Everybody desired to see and wish bon voyage to the brave soldiers who were going away to take part as representatives of the Siamese nation in the Great War. The soldiers then cheered them all and sang patriotic songs. On passing the legations of the Allied powers, tremendous cheers were raised in honor of the Allies, whose representatives had a rather sudden awakening on that memorable morning. End quote. We've come across reports of some of the volunteers attempting to literally jump ship, and we can't say at this stage whether really all of the 1,200 men had indeed volunteered freely or had been told to volunteer. We may safely assume that in any case, the prospect of actually sailing to Europe and to this great war will have been a very intimidating prospect for all of the soldiers. Here's a photo taken on board the Empire before it set sail from Koh Sichan. Via Singapore, Colombo, and Port Said, the Empire sailed safely to Marseille. Of course, during times of war, this is not trivial. She arrived there after 5 weeks on 30 July 1918. As festive as the send-off had been, as bleak was the welcome. The French government had not sent a big welcome committee, and Prince Jarun had not managed to arrive in Marseille in time. Some French military officials even mistook them for contract laborers, which was exactly what the Siamese diplomats had gone to pains trying to avoid. Under all circumstances, they wanted to prevent that Siam's troops were lumped together with Indo-Chinese colonial subjects. After all, a central purpose of the expeditionary force was to display Siam's ability and degree of civilization as a sovereign kingdom. Moreover, the Siamese kingdom was arriving at a time when some 10,000 American troops were arriving in France every day, further diminishing the attention they received, understandably. But with some last-minute effort, a Siamese-French welcome committee was put together after all for the following day, and albeit somewhat unceremoniously, the troops embarked and marched to their quarters outside of Marseille. Here are two photos which show the actual arrival of the troops in Marseille. From there, the aviation corps was transferred to a camp at Istres and to Avaux. These are both small towns in central France, southern central France, where the officers and diplomats tried to set them up as well as possible. The transport corps was transferred to a camp at Lyon and was met there with more favorable conditions. Pilots and mechanics in Istres and Avaux received 3 months of training until late October, while the transport corps was split into 2 groups of roughly 400 men, and each received some 3 weeks of training. While in France, the Expeditionary Corps was subject to its own military jurisdiction, which is interesting in light of the situation back home in Siam, where France and other countries had secured so-called extraterritorial jurisdiction in their treaties with the Siamese kings. That means that a Frenchman in Siam was not subject to Siamese jurisdiction, but to French consular jurisdiction. And now, the same was the case for Siamese soldiers in France. The First World War coincided with the great influenza epidemic of 1918-19, which claimed between 50 and 100 million lives across the globe and was the worst natural disaster in human history. War and death on an unprecedented scale, famine, freezing temperatures, a pandemic infecting nearly everyone. In short, Europe in the winter of 1918 was not the kind of place one would have wanted to visit. But this was exactly where 1,200 Thai soldiers found themselves. Half of the 19 deaths among the expeditionary force were from influenza, while the other fatalities resulted from a variety of accidents and other illnesses. By the way, there are some books that still uphold that Siamese soldiers were killed in battle, but this is, of course, a myth. And one more note on influenza. We should not forget that during these months of 1918-1919, Bangkok alone recorded 200,000 cases, and the pandemic reached virtually every part of the world. So this was not specific to Europe. Now, not all was suffering and death. We found an article from an American newspaper which provided perhaps the most light-hearted reporting to be found on the Siamese Expeditionary Force. I quote, "Speaking of casualties, unless somebody hurries up and tells Siamese troops fighting with the Allies a few things about the great American game of baseball, they are in danger of being entirely wiped out. They are nice boys and they look like good troops. They are snappy and smart and well-disciplined. But someone must take them aside and confidentially explain that a baseball, when it comes into contact with a human skull, is to be classed as a dangerous weapon." Obviously, the soldiers were using the baseball to play takraw, and the article explained the game to some detail to the Western reader, before explaining that at their camp in France, the Siamese troops were eager to learn to play baseball, and an American athletics trainer attached to the American troops in the camp had offered to teach them. The rules were explained with the help of interpreters, and a diamond was laid out, a baseball field. But again, I quote, "To the horror of the Americans present, the batter," the one with a wooden stick, promptly stuck his head in the way of the ball instead of using the bat. The instructor soon halted the game. He saw all sorts of international tangles might develop if he permitted soldiers of an allied power to commit suicide one by one. When one of them acquired a lump the size of an egg on his head, it is regarded as an honorable wound. And as for the pain, c'est la guerre. That's war. Now I'd like to show you a collection of photos depicting the Siamese soldiers in France. First is a series of photos all showing the aviation corps. A hint is the airplane on the top photo. These photos are mainly during their training in the French flying school near Istres. You can see them very smartly dressed in the uniforms on the top right with which they came from Bangkok. These are thin khaki uniforms which they then exchanged for more appropriate, much warmer uniforms. Here, this is the railway station of Istres, and here we see flying training. Now, after spending some 2 months in camp, the motor corps was moved to a town called Villemoyen, just behind the front. This was in October 1918. And here they began supplying the front using French trucks. Here's some photos of the French troops in France. You see them arriving here. This is with the new uniforms already, the warmer ones. Here you see French and Thai officers together. Again, most of the photos are of officers. This was considered to be much more worthy of photo at the time. The photo in the center at the bottom is taken in Versailles, actually, at Versailles Castle. And here, this is the quality of the photo is not good, but I do like it very much. You see the truck, the Thai flag pinned to the truck to identify it, and you see that there are French and Thai soldiers in what looks to be a good camaraderie. This photo is significant because it does not seem to reflect the norm. In fact, tensions between the Siamese troops and their French liaison officers had been building already during the weeks in camp, but now under combat conditions they came to a head. The first issue was language. The Siamese side had recruited all suitable students studying in Europe to act as interpreters, but it remained a challenge to communicate effectively with the French officers during the difficult conditions of frontline action. The file suggests that the French army was ill-prepared to properly integrate the Siamese troops into ongoing military operations, and that this was due to a large degree to the condescending and even racist attitudes displayed by the French liaison officers. They increasingly abandoned their assigned roles as advisors and began ordering the Siamese troops directly, sidelining the Siamese commanders. Prince Jarun informed the king in late October that, quote, "Of course, our men resent it greatly and simply hate the French now. I am deeply sorry," the prince wrote, "that this result is quite opposite to what our intention should be and that of your Majesty's policy." While the Siamese commanders and diplomats in France did privately acknowledge that there were problems in their own communication with the French, the effect of French behavior must have been catastrophic. Once again, Prince Jarun to the king, I quote, "Instead of bringing away pleasant souvenirs of good fellowship, our men will bring back hatred," end quote. With hindsight, we can assume that 100 years ago, the necessary intercultural communication skills were not well developed on both sides to begin with, and it may have been too much to ask from French soldiers who had constantly been at war for the preceding 3 years. Princess Charun and Amoratat, as well as Praya Pichai, raised the issue with the French military command and the French foreign ministry. And it was particularly the latter which was alarmed by this and by the detrimental effect it was having on the goals they were pursuing by having Siamese troops in France. The situation deteriorated so far that King Wachirawut and Prince Chakrapong in Bangkok and the Princes Amoratat and Charun in Paris contemplated aborting the mission. But then the armistice was signed on 11 November and fighting ceased, removing much of the pressure from the situation. The French file suggests that in reaction to the worrying situation between French and Siamese commanders, the French Foreign Ministry triggered the military command to order the Siamese motor corps to cross into German territory behind their own troops. It seems to us at this point in our research that the Thai occupation of Germany was not the result of a tactical military decision, but a political effort to appease the greatly upset ally. The French files further suggest the same for the later conferral of the French War Cross on the motor corps, which also happened on German territory. All of this greatly pleased all involved, from the military commanders in Europe to the king in Bangkok himself. In the end, they were willing to put the animosities away and focus on reaping the political benefits from the tremendous effort of deploying troops to Europe. The significance of these events is expressed in a telegram Preya Pichai wrote to the king on 10 December 1918, quote, "Today your majesty's troops have advanced into the soil of the enemy, proclaiming the power of a powerful king, with the Siamese flag flourishing highly over them." I quoted part of the king's reply already at the outset of my talk. Again, it was the proudest day of my life when I learned that my troops had advanced into enemy territory. The memories of this glorious event will forever live in my mind as an incentive to further sacrifice on behalf of my beloved nation and motherland. Congratulations and blessings to my gallant troops as from one comrade to another in active service. End quote. You'll note how the king presented himself as a soldier king, as a comrade of the troops, as one of them. It informs us on the function of Siam's participation in the war as a vehicle to strengthen national unity and patriotism, where the soldier king stands at the center of both the nation and the war effort. Modern technology was also employed to bring home to Bangkok the message of the patriotic soldiers who were proclaiming the power of the king in Europe. The Patanakon Cinematography Company, which no longer exists, commissioned a documentary film which was shown here in cinemas in January and February of 1919. Here, this is the advertisement for the film. The first screening was a rather grand affair under patronage of Prince Chakrapong, the proceeds of which went to the Siamese Red Cross. It would be a miracle if copies of this movie, of this film, still exist today. I don't think so, but it's something we still need to look into with the film archive. The main contingent of the Motor Corps stayed in Germany until July 1919, meaning they spent over half a year as occupiers. Their area of operation was Palatinate, a very beautiful wine country along the Rhine River, also known generally as the Rhineland. You may know Frankfurt, which is not too far away from there. So far, we cannot provide many details of their assignment, but it was likely being there in the first place, just as the French occupation generally was primarily a symbolic act designed to humiliate the defeated enemy and create a demilitarized safety buffer along the borders of France and Belgium. Apart from that, the Motor Corps had logistical tasks in further supplying the occupying troops in Palatinate. Let's look at some of the photos of the Siamese occupation of Germany. Now, different from the previous set of photos, these were all taken in Germany. Here, this is where the troops received their flag, and on the right, they received the French War Cross that I was referring to earlier. Here are some of the buildings. These are photos from the National Archives here in Bangkok, which makes them rather significant. I find they show German buildings that were used by the troops. Here are some nice pictures of the trucks that they used. These were logistical troops, we would say with a modern term, so they were driving these trucks around. And apparently they spent more time driving them around, more time fixing them than driving them around. This one here looks kind of cool, I find, on the motorbike with the sidecar. An intriguing aspect of the Rhineland occupation was race. The French army purposely posted black North African troops in Germany in an effort to further humiliate the enemy. This caused outrage among the Germans, who even coined the phrase of the black shame to describe being occupied by the uncivilized. So France was using its own racism as a tool to humiliate racist Germans. We've not yet found any documents in this regard, but perhaps the same racist logic played a role in the French decision to also send Thai troops to Germany. And we may assume that once the Asian occupiers settled into the quaint and conservative German countryside, the effect on the population will have been similar. What an additional shame to be occupied by non-Europeans. This aspect reminds us once more of how significant and highly unusual the Siamese expeditionary force was at the height of Western imperialism. Before we let the war end in our story, I wanted to show you two more slides. The first one relates to the flag, which you see here in the middle. The three-color flag we know today was used by the Siamese expeditionary force in Europe. They set off in 1918 with only one flag, and this flag stayed with the Aviation Corps. A second flag was therefore consecrated by the king, seen here on the right, and shipped off to Europe for the Motor Corps. They received it when they were already in Germany, as we saw on the photo earlier. Here it's depicted once more on the left. The other slide I wanted to show you depicts graves of Siamese soldiers in Germany and France. Of the 19 soldiers who died, 2 passed away already in Bangkok, and 1 died of pneumonia in France before the armistice. After the end of fighting, 8 soldiers died in Germany, 8 in France. Most of them in the cold winter months, January to March 1919, and most of them from pneumonia or influenza. The dead were cremated and their ashes buried. I don't know whether part of their ashes were then brought back to Bangkok or whether the graves were reopened and all ashes were brought back and enshrined in the memorial to the Siamese Expeditionary Force. Highly symbolic was Siam's participation in the victory parades the Allies organized in July. These parades were opportunities to visually demonstrate Siam's presence in the capitals of the great European powers under the eyes of kings and presidents. This photo here of Thai troops marching through the Arc de Triomphe in Paris is perhaps the most iconic image of Siam's involvement in the war, and rightly so. No other image symbolizes the significance of events as Siamese troops proudly carrying the elephant. Siamese troops also marched in the 2 other big victory parades in London and Brussels, and photos of these two occasions have also survived. It will have been a matter of particular pride for the Anglophile King Wachirawut that his troops were marching on the Mall in London. But again, we should put this into perspective by pointing out that some 50 Siamese troops joined the 15,000 that marched through London on 19 July. The expeditionary force returned to Bangkok in 2 batches. 345 officers and men of the Aviation Corps left France without having been to the front in March and arrived in May. The Motor Corps returned to Bangkok in September, and on this occasion the government also organized the official peace celebrations. I have 4 slides for you showing the troops coming back. On the top right, they're still on board of the ship. On the top left, you can see the welcome committee before they land. Here you see the king himself inspecting the troops. On the top right, King Rama VI is embracing Praya Pichai, thanking him for his service. Here again, a rather rare photo I find because it shows normal soldiers being treated to food and drink as opposed to the senior officials. On the top left is the Supreme Patriarch, the king's brother, blessing the returning troops. Is there another one? Yes, there's another one. Look, they managed to get hundreds and hundreds on one photo. How are we doing time-wise?
5-10 more minutes.
Okay, that's great. Then I'll shorten this a bit, but let me try to give you a little bit of the flavor of these 2 momentous occasions when the troops returned. This is how the Bangkok Times described the arrival of the Aviation Corps. I quote, "Buildings along the river and along the route from the landing to the palace were decorated. The return of the troops from Europe meant the end of anxiety to many, and relations and friends turned out and lined the road from the landing to the palace gates so that it was impossible to move about. There was also a great feeling of pride in the part of the victorious troops of Siam had played in the war. It was no boisterous welcome that the men received, but a hearty homecoming, combined with a genuine thankfulness that the menfolk who had gone on the great adventure and into the unknown foreign lands were safely back, well and fit. The men were in heavy khaki but looked smart, serviceable and healthy. Many had a distinct ruddiness of complexion, not at all unbecoming, and the contrast between the overseas contingent as they swung along the road leading to the palace and the home troops lining the road was quite marked. I'll end the quote here. Let me read you part of the King's speech of September 1919 to the returning troops, which was rich in symbolism and emotion. Again, I quote, "Soldiers, I give you all warm welcome on your return to the mother country. In greeting you today, I feel myself so filled with emotion that I can hardly speak. You were determined to show to all the world at large that in Siam, as well as in our Siamese race, right has not been lost sight of. I mean that respect for right which has made us into a nation, a compact nation, and which can be summoned up by loyalty to the sovereign, loyalty to the nation, and steadfastness in the noble faith we hold. You have sacrificed all. You sacrificed your homes and everything you possessed, every part of your bodies and even your lives. What for? For the cause of right, which has made us up into a nation to the present day. When you were going away, I felt as I was parting with a portion of myself. Therefore, when you have now come back and I meet you all once more, I feel like seeing close relations or the best of friends. It is a natural fact that when one is near a friend, one does not usually realize the depth of affection which one has for him, and only when distance separates us does one feel such an affection. Well, such a feeling did indeed occur to me. And therefore, I was always anxious to hear such a feeling. I was always anxious to hear how you, who had gone out to the war, were doing and acting. Every time I heard of your deeds, I felt as though I myself were participating therein. When any one of you was in trouble or danger, I felt anxious. Whenever I felt or heard that you were acquitting yourselves well, I also became filled with joy, as if I had done well myself. Now that you have all returned, it is evident that your lives have not been wasted. You have enhanced the fame of our nation, for you have shown the world that there is still a great number of us Siamese who know how to act like men." End quote. In September, public holidays were decreed and the peace celebrations lasted 4 days, during which, according to newspaper reports, the city was captured by a shared sense of pride. On the first day after the King's speech, we just heard the troops march past the King and to the Ministry of War. That evening, the expeditionary force was joined by regular troops for a torchlight procession, after once more being inspected by the King and singing the national anthem. On the second day, a Thanksgiving service was held at Wat Prakeo, with the expeditionary force and the King in attendance. These ceremonies were followed in the evening by a state banquet at the Grand Palace for all senior members of the royal family, senior government and military officials, the officers of the expeditionary force, and representatives of the allied nations. On the third day of celebrations, the foreign community of Bangkok organized a sports competition. And on the fourth and final day, the ashes of the 19 soldiers who had died were carried in a procession from the War Ministry to Wat Mahatat for the memorial service, and then enshrined in the King's presence in the newly erected memorial at the northwestern corner of Sanam Luang. This memorial is what you can still see today. As the buildings and roads around it have expanded in the century since, it appears much smaller than it will have when it was erected, but it retains its beauty and the significance of its location, both then and now. The troops were then demobilized, but their legacy and the legacy of these events obviously lives on. The story we've been looking at today centered around two crucial decisions. The first was the decision to declare war in July 1917. The second crucial decision, to send troops to Europe, meant Siam was actually going to war. And going to war became a focal point for elite-driven nationalism and a reaffirmation of royal power. By sending Siamese troops to fight abroad, the kingdom was signaling its existence to the Western world as a partner who was willing to share the burden of war and demanded to be treated equally, and with respect. By way of concluding, I'll try to be quick, I would like to try and summarize this legacy and its short-term, medium-term, and long-term effects very briefly. The most significant outcome of joining the war was that Siam won the war. It renounced its unequal treaty with Germany and dictated the terms of peace as a junior partner along the Western allies in the Treaty of Versailles. This is the treaty on the left, and on the right you can see the signatures of Prince Jarun and Prince Traitot Prapan in the center of the page. The United States then, and in the following years also Great Britain and France, rescinded their unequal treaties, and Siam regained sovereignty over its trade and public finances. And by the 1930s, the last remnants of extraterritorial jurisdiction were then also thrown out. The second most significant impact of joining the war was Siam's greatly enhanced role internationally, as it became a founding member of the League of Nations. This precursor of today's United Nations was a global forum of its day in which the international community tried to manage war and peace. In both aspects, sovereignty and international stature, policymakers skillfully leveraged Siam's participation in the war as a key argument in demanding equal treatment from France and from Britain. We can see that successful results were not a given by looking at the example of China, by the way. While the contexts of China and Siam were not identical, China also declared war in 1917 to benefit from a post-war settlement, but it was not entirely successful. Thirdly, coming out of the war victoriously gave elite-driven nationalism a strong boost. The king expressed this in his speeches to the returning troops at the two very carefully staged celebrations in 1919. However, this was then of course quickly overshadowed by the financial and economic difficulties that beset the kingdom during the final years of the Sixth Reign. Fourthly, a further effect the war had in Siam was that it served as a catalyst for modernizing the military, especially in aviation. Siam now possessed trained pilots, mechanics, drivers, and officers with a first-hand understanding of modern warfare. And fifth and finally, in terms of foreign influence on Siam's policies, Britain did indeed manage to strengthen its position further, with Germany having been removed from the picture. France's position did not receive a significant boost as far as I can tell, and a few years later, not only did German diplomats and businessmen return to Bangkok, but a new competitor in the game of vying for government attention and commercial stakes emerged with Japan. In Europe, the end of the World War and the Treaty of Versailles left much of the continent in ruins and nations bitterly opposed to one another. The following 20 years saw a number of promising efforts of reconciliation and continuous hopes of many that a new international system would create a durable peace. But in the end, the divisive legacy of World War I proved too strong and had sown the seed for the second explosion of aggression and chauvinism that originated once more in Germany, soon engulfed the entire continent and even the world as a whole. And this time, in the Second World War, the war even came to Thailand. We understand World War I today as the great catastrophe that bred much of the suffering of the 20th century. As Ajahn Pawan and I hope to show in our forthcoming research, World War I was also a decisive event in Thai history, although Siam's participation in the war had no major military significance. France's suggestion to send troops to Europe was as much politically motivated as was Siam's acceptance to do so. The political gains Siam got from participating in the war were remarkable and shaped the final years of absolute monarchy as well as the events after 1932 in terms of foreign relations as well as social and economic development. So let me close with this magnificent victory poster here. Like Narai or Vishnu, Rama VI is riding Garuda, flanked by the royal flag as well as by the new national flag. The victorious king is surrounded by a wreath into which are woven the allied flags, all significantly smaller than the Thai flag. And with this image, I'd like to thank Ajahn Wasana and Ajahn Pawan once again, thank the history department, thank all of you for bearing with me. It took me a little longer than I thought. I hope we're still okay to leave the compound with everything going on outside. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And Indeed, unfortunately, you would all have to trust me and Ajahn Prawan to continue on grilling Dr. Stefan Hell over dinner about this presentation. In fact, I'm very fascinated with your comparisons to China and have plenty of questions on that. But just to make sure that we can leave the compound, I think we should probably head out. ก็ขอบพระคุณทุกท่านมากนะคะวันนี้อาจจะต้องรีบจบก่อนที่จะมีคำถามเพราะว่าเดี๋ยวประตูมหาลัยปิด6 โมงเย็นแล้วจะออกกันลำบากนะคะก็ขอบพระคุณมากค่ะสัปดาห์หน้าวันที่5นะคะเป็นอาจารย์จุนิตพงศ์นะคะที่เลื่อนมาจากคราวที่โดนบังคับปิดรอบนั้นนะคะจะมาพูดเรื่องการปฏิวัติอิสลามแล้วก็อิทธิพลที่มีต่อเอเชียตะวันออกเฉียงใต้นะคะก็หวังเป็นอย่างยิ่งว่าเราจะได้ใช้เวลาตามปกติ 4 โมงครึ่งถึง 6 โมงครึ่งนะคะแต่ถ้ามีความเปลี่ยนแปลงอันใดก็จะแจ้งให้ทราบทาง Facebook ต่อไปนะคะขอบคุณค่ะ